Good evening and welcome again to another edition of Tok Piksa. In November this year, senior MTV News journalist Meredith traveled to the United States under a U.S. government-sponsored program. The program was the Edward R. Murrow Project for Journalists. Edward R. Murrow was a prominent journalist in the U.S. who first came to prominence through a series of radio news broadcasts he filed during World War II. Considered one of U.S. journalism's greatest advocates, Murrow was known for his honesty and integrity in delivering the news. While the program's main agenda was to provide visiting journalists a glimpse into the history of journalism in America, it gave them first-hand information on American politics, society, and lifestyle. We asked Meredith what she gained from the trip and what lessons Papua New Guinea and news in Papua New Guinea could learn from the U.S. Meredith, tell us about the program. Tell us about your experiences in the U.S. and the media.
Thank you, Neville. Well, I was selected under the International Visitor Learning Program. I was nominated by the U.S. Embassy here in PNG, but through the Papua New Guinea board, they selected me to go for the trip, specifically under the Edward R. Murrow program. Edward R. Murrow is a very famous, distinguished journalist in the U.S. He sort of set the benchmark for broadcast journalists over there. So there were over 100 of us that got selected to go there from all over the world. I was in the East Asia Pacific group. They split us into smaller groups so that we could cover the whole of the states. So basically our first leg of the trip, we were in Washington, and then we traveled to Phoenix, Arizona, Florida, and then we stopped in New York. That was the last leg of the trip. Basically, they wanted us to learn about journalism in the country and everything about the United States, culture to politics.
Washington, D.C., what did you do there?
Okay, Washington, D.C. was basically an introduction, a formal introduction into America, into the politics, and into how journalism has evolved. We got to visit the museum. The museum is sort of like a museum, but specifically for news alone. So that gave us an understanding of how journalism or the media has evolved from mainstream media, like the olden days, from radio, and to how today news has evolved into the digital age because of the internet technology. So news has become like a fast-paced type of business. Audiences there, they can choose what type of news they want. And we also got to meet the Secretary of State, John Kerry. He spoke about the role of the media, how we're watchdogs and climate change, all those type of political type of issues. And we also met with a panel of distinguished journalists there, and they discussed about their lives.
Okay. When you say media, how different is the U.S. media from PNG media today?
Okay, U.S., as we all know, is a very highly advanced country in terms of technology. So they've become sort of like fast-paced in a way, but then at the same time they still use like the traditional methods of getting news. Like the principle is still there, but the technology has become more advanced, and that's something I think Papua New Guinea can learn from. I mean, we're still a developing country, and we're still yet to reach that stage.
That's a good point you bring up there, because you mentioned museum. So I'm assuming that the museum contained historical archives and footage and information about people like Edward R. Murrow, who's a broadcaster who's actually the person to and the standard to look up to these days. Where are we in PNG with regards to harnessing our history in the media?
I think we're a relatively young country, and in Papua New Guinea, what saddened me the most is that it's a thriving industry, but we have this high turnover of journalists. I don't know whether it's a problem with the companies they work for, but there needs to be more of this want to stay on in the profession. So in the US, it was really good to see senior type of journalists that have been in the industry, and they have this hunger to look for news. And I think the media organizations there, they sort of see this hunger by the journalists, and they have this type of like promotion. They promote the journalists, and in that way, that's the way they retain the journalists to stay in the field. Now, Papua New Guinea, our media industry, somehow they can reward the journalists for the work they do. They can probably go out, get the hard stories, do more investigative type of journalism, and basically, yeah, be more proactive as a watchdog for a country like Papua New Guinea. We definitely are a country that needs more eyes in terms of like unraveling corruption in the country. And I think the US sort of set that benchmark to go out there and get the real stories that can change the country.
So obviously there's similar things, news values, traditional modes of collecting news and presenting it. We in Papua New Guinea, the news media now are moving forward into new technology. Is there anything that you've noticed in your experience, how outside of the financial side, outside of the welfare of journalists themselves, is there anything in America that shows you that there's more than just money that's involved in whether a journalist sticks in their profession or not?
The news medias have evolved in a way that when they're seeking funds for the certain programs, they look for sponsors that are into like social issues, so that when a certain story might be sensitive or whatever, if it's like you have a major sponsor, which is a corporate organization,
Yes.
you'll have this thought of, what if I run that story? And then they pull the plug on the sponsorship. So what the United States now is doing, especially with some of the public television stations, they're choosy about who sponsors the programs. So in that way, it's a bit more, they can run programs with a clear conscience.
Okay. So you mentioned a panel discussion with 3 senior reporters. In the States, national security is a major issue. What was discussed? What was discussed on the panel?
Okay, so the 3 distinguished journalists, they were all female. Jill Doherty of CNN, Rachel Griffin of Fox News, and Shio Ben Gorman of the Wall Street Journal. National security is a really big issue in America. So they were asked, what happens when you're faced with a really good story, but then you have to protect the national security interest of the country? And that topic came about because of the latest saga with Edward Snowden saga. He's a former national security agent worker, and he decided to get about 200 worth of documents out from NSA and practically just spread it out to the press. And in those documents, it revealed how the NSA was encrypting messages from its enemies, but not only from its enemies, but also from the public of America that tap into phones, emails. So it's like basically your information isn't safe anymore. So that's how the topic came about.
Okay. That, of course, leads to the next issue that we'll probably be discussing, and that's self-censorship in the media. I mean, here in PNG, we have there are individual media houses who probably approach that issue differently. How is it done in the US?
Okay, so self-censorship is basically when you're faced with a certain story. It might be sensitive, and then you have to decide whether it's okay to run that story or not. Rachel Griffin of Fox News, she gave an example of her plus a number of journalists that went into the Middle East. They covered a story. They were there with certain guides, but then they were not allowed to cover some sides of it. So they decided to discreetly, when the guides were not aware of it, to meet up with a woman who said she wanted to be interviewed. So they got her story, went to America and ran the story. But after they ran the story, some days later, that woman was killed. So had they self-censored themselves and thought that maybe if we run this story, something could happen to this woman, then the woman would still be alive today. So that's something they've had to live with. So the advice they gave us, the journalists, was, when you're trying to run a sensitive story, what's the worst that could happen? So that's something that I'll take back with me now. When I'm trying to run a sensitive story, what's the worst that could happen?
Okay.
Yeah.
So you judge the strength of the story that you have and the argument on whether it's to be run or not based on the fallout effect of the story and who's included in that fallout effect, and whether it's something to do with national security or whether it's an individual. Is there a need in Papua New Guinea? Do you feel there's a need for self-censorship?
Yeah, in Papua New Guinea, there is a need. Sometimes we get a lot of ear bashing after a certain story goes on air. I would name specific media, but just like across the board. But sometimes it's because of time constraints that we're under this pressure to get the news out on the day, that sometimes it's like an afterthought or something. Like we don't have the time to ask them for the comment. But even if we do ask them for the comment, they don't come back to us on time.
Self-censorship is one thing. Are there any other aspects of reporting in the US today that you feel we don't do here in PNG?
Okay, yeah, that's a very interesting question, because there we found out about a data journalism. That's a new type of journalism they're having there, so I was very interested in that. But why it works for them is because the government records everything there, it's set there, and whenever journalists or whoever wants the information wants it, then they can get it. And I think that's something that lacks here in Papua New Guinea. Like, for example, the planning department, that's supposed to be like the central location for everything, the data, information, whatnot that we need. So data journalism is basically like you collect information, and then you can make graphics or some type of graph out of it, so it makes it easier for the reader to learn about certain probably infrastructure, like for example, how many bad bridges are in the country that needs fixing. You have a graph for all of that. Now, since we don't have that type of information here, that's a bit hard for us to do. So that's something probably like our government can work on if it wants probably the citizens to appreciate more or know what the government is doing.
So that's obviously based on the integrity of statistics that our National Planning Department has, and NSO has,
Yeah.
NRI, organizations like that.
Yeah, like that. Or not only that, the information can be taken from everywhere, anywhere, and it's a process of filtering the information and getting what's really needed so that a simplified story can be told.
You visited the Arizona Republic, a multifaceted network. They've actually developed a social network strategy. We've got a big social network following here in PNG. What lessons can we learn from them?
Yeah, social media now, it's sort of changing the way how traditional media is run in the US and here in Papua New Guinea as well. Social media, right now the mainstream media is getting tip-offs from social media to make bigger stories. So at the Arizona Republic, they've decided to make a department for social media alone. So that was something new. Like here, it's probably just something on the side, but there it's like a department on its own. So all the journalists there, they have mobile phones. So when they're out on their stories, they get a picture of whatever that story is, and they do a little description, and then they send it over to their website or their Facebook page or their Twitter account. And that's like something to look forward to for the main news, before the main news comes on. The
experience here in PNG with social media has been that there's a lot of people out there who have a point of view about any particular issue. How do we deal with that, with validating it, coming back to verification again?
Okay, so social media, like someone has a viewpoint, but then it's an onus for us, the mainstream media, to make sure it's substantiated or there's clarity in it. So like they've just pinpointed something, we take them as a reference, but then we can make it into a proper story so that it has substance in it again. So I think that's how we can, the mainstream media still has a role of validating. Like social media, you can say so much, but then in the end, what the mainstream media has is that probably respectability. People will be like, okay, let's tune into MTV to see whether this story is true or not, or what they have. Okay. Yeah.
Right. Of course, if you go to the US, you can't go past visiting places like the Grand Canyon. Could you tell us about your experience there?
Oh, yeah. So after Washington, we visited Arizona, Phoenix, Arizona. But first of all, we were in, we visited a university. It's a journalism university. Okay. Practically everything about journalism. So that was eye-opening for me, an eye-opening experience, because it's like full on. You learn about radio, television, print, and it's like the journalists there, they're practically molded into journalism beings, if I can say that. But then we also got to see the Grand Canyon, and it's like one of the wonders of the world. So, but it was cold there. Not a lot of Americans there go there, so it was like privilege for us, the 12 journalists in the East Asia Pacific group, to go there and just experience a bit of the culture, probably about the native Indians there. So that was a good experience. Okay.
Tell us about the other members of your group, the other journalists from the different countries. Which countries did they come from? And what were their experiences? What did they take to this program?
Okay. So the East Asia Pacific group, there was one from Australia, a Tongan, two from Indonesia, one from Vietnam, two from China, one from Taiwan, and one from Hong Kong. They're all well respected in their countries. And I think that one main lesson all of us took back was the social media aspect of it, how social media can help transform our different countries. We also learned a lot from each other too. Like for instance, the Chinese, they have to deal a lot with the censorship issue. They were in America, and it's the only time they got to use Facebook. So it was sort of like a liberating time for them, because they could post whatever they wanted to. And right now they're back in their country, they're off the map now. We're all friends on social media, but we don't know what the Chinese are doing right now, because they're
you can't reach them.
Yeah, we can't reach them. They're censored by the government.
These are the countries, I mean, they're probably more developed than what Papua New Guinea is. Did they speak of any of the challenges, and do we have similar challenges to what they're facing?
I think, yeah, something about all the rest of the country or the rest of the world is trying to get that information that we need for the story. And that's, we sort of vented our frustration about, like, sometimes we want the information, but these people are not willing to talk, or they probably go this way. We're waiting for them for hours. So that's a similarity that we had. And as well as that was the fact that sometimes the sponsors or corporate organizations that they're the ones that, you know, help pay for the bread and butter for, sometimes they're the ones that stop us from running a certain sensitive type of news. So
are there any lessons that we could probably impart to them? We have a different approach to our leaders here. Sometimes we idolize our leaders a bit too much. What's it like? What's the politics and media relationship like in the US?
I think in Papua New Guinea we have this big man type of mentality where we give too much respect to people like politicians, and that sort of restrains us from asking the hard questions. It's like, oh, I'm big man Thomas, or we can't ask him that, he might get angry or something. But in the US, it's like, who are you? You may be the president, but we need to ask you this question because the people want to know why this is happening. And I think that's something that us as Papua New Guinea, I think it might be a cultural kind of thing, so we're restrained not to ask the questions, but I think it's important as a developing country that we ask the hard questions in order for us to move forward and become a developed country. That's the only way we can move forward.
Okay.
Yeah.
Now on the other foot, what's the relationship with between the politicians and the media? How do they use the media in the US that's different from the way our leaders use the media here?
Okay. In the US, they have correspondents that work within the State Departments, and they, like Jill Doherty of CNN, for example, she's basically with the US government, and they use her as a correspondent. So whenever CNN wants stories from her, then she's already available. So in a way, that's like partnership, so that the information can go out to the public. So they have journalists that are already in there. They're well-trained journalists. They know the ethics and what type of content to give out. So if we probably had that in PNG too, whenever we wanted certain information, then we can just say, hey, are you available, whoever's in the department, and can you give us some information about what's happening there now? So that's probably something we can learn from too.
The Pensacola Journal, it uses what's called a chart beat to monitor its stories. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yeah. Pensacola News Journal, as well as the other media organizations, the television, they use the chart beat. Chart beat is, it shows what's going on the website, a whole list of it, and it shows in real time which story is being the most read or being watched. So that gives them an idea of what type of news stories are making news, or what type of stories are weak, and how they can improve those stories so that more of their readers can tune in, or how they can, basically improve on the story.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's interesting. And your final destination was cold New York, the center for entertainment, I believe, in the US. How did you find it?
Yes, New York, cold New York. I was expecting snow to fall, but it wasn't cold enough, so no snow there. We got to watch a Broadway show, which was a very good experience, eye-opening experience, because people sing and do acrobatic acts at the same time. It was the last part of a trip. Basically, the 100+ journalists we met there, and we gave a final summary of what type of lessons that we learned during that trip, and appreciation. We showed our appreciation towards the US state government for sponsoring us to go to the US and learn about the US journalism over there, culture and interactions with the people. And one intriguing thing about New York was when we went to The Economist. Economist is a business magazine there. They don't have bylines in their reports, and that's because they believe that the reports that are written in there, they're substantiated enough. Like the journalists, they practically research or they debate what they're trying to write, and they put their own opinions into the article. So that was something new for me, because in school, at university, they told us, media, you're supposed to be neutral. You're not supposed to put your own opinions into. But these people from The Economist, they're putting their own opinions in there, and somehow they're respected for that opinion that they make, and it does influence policy change. So that was an experience there.
Okay. So overall, US being a developed country, years ahead from what Papua New Guinea is today, we still have to build up our history of journalists like Edward R. Murrows for the US. What's the next step for us? We're moving into a new digital age of journalism. Are we doing everything right according to what you've seen in the US?
We're getting there, slowly but surely we're getting there. In Papua New Guinea, for broadcast, we have the likes of John Eggins. He can be like the Edward R. Murrow of Papua New Guinea. But one thing, the media industry, the industry itself needs to support the journalists. That's so much we can do, but if the industry itself isn't supporting the journalists, then the journalists, they feel like there's no one there for them, so they tend to go off. So I think we need to work on retaining our senior journalists to stay into mainstream for the betterment of the country, going for the hard stories. And in terms of the government helping with the dissemination of information, I think they need to invest more in infrastructure like towers so that the internet can reach our rural majority, our illiterate population, because as long as everyone is educated or they're literate, then they can help themselves. They can make more informed type of decisions. I mean, we can have access to roads too, but access to information as well would be really good for us to move forward.
Okay, I think you've summed it up well there. The key notes that I've taken away from what you just said were access to information and making better informed decisions, which is what I feel is the main role for journalists here in PNG. Meredith, thank you very much for your time. It's been enlightening, your talk with us this afternoon.
Thank you very much. It's been a pleasure.
And that was Meredith Kusa, senior journalist with National MTV News. There are lessons that the media can take away from the kind of program she attended, but there are even more lessons that our leaders and civil society can learn from the States. We have learned something new tonight. I hope you have too. We'll do this again next week on Tok Piksa.